Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into the gritty world of a medieval merchant. You might imagine yourself counting gold coins by a warm fire, or leisurely negotiating deals over fine wine. But truth be told, the life was far tougher than it sounds. In medieval times, merchants were the lifeblood of towns and cities, trading wool, spices, cloth, and sometimes secrets. But behind every profitable deal lay long days of haggling, sleepless nights guarding wares, and navigating a maze of politics and rivalries that could ruin you overnight. So, before you get cozy under that warm blanket, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if what I do here genuinely helps you wind down at night. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? There's something oddly soothing about knowing there are others awake with us, wandering through history together. Now, dim the lights. Pull your blanket a little tighter. Maybe let the soft hum of a fan or a quiet night settle in. Let your imagination carry you back to a time when the streets buzzed with the clatter of merchants and the scent of goods from faraway lands. You've just woken up in the year 1325, and not in a soft bed surrounded by birdsong and clean linen. No, you've jolted upright in a dark, splintered room above your father's shop in the middle of a medieval market town. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the rats. Your mattress, if we can dignify it with that name, is a bag of straw that's been slept on by 3 generations, and possibly 1 goat. You're lying beneath a wool blanket that smells like mildew and old onions, which makes sense, because last week it doubled as a sack for transporting turnips. There's no pillow, just a folded tunic. It's itchy, it smells like feet, and it's also the one clean tunic you were saving for market day. You blink into the gloom. The only light comes from the narrow gaps in the wooden shutters where daylight is trying, politely, to introduce itself. Someone downstairs is already awake, coughing like a broken bellows. Probably your uncle, or your cousin, or your aunt's second husband who arrived 6 months ago and never left. Your home is not really a home. It's a mixed-use medieval property. Half business, half lodging, all chaos. Privacy? What a modern fantasy. You sleep beside your siblings, your apprentices, your cousins, and occasionally the neighbor's child who just needed a place to nap. The walls are thin. The air is thick. Your room is above the main shop, and the smell of dried fish and fermented cabbage is wafting through the floorboards like a ghost you can't exorcise. No time to dwell on that, though, because the town bell just clanged 5 times, and in medieval merchant terms, that's basically your alarm clock, your calendar, your GPS, and your existential dread all rolled into one. It's early, it's cold, and it's time to prepare for the market. You swing your legs out of bed and instantly regret it. The floor is either wet, sticky, or both. You don't ask questions. You just avoid the worst puddles and shuffle into your stiff woolen clothes, still crusty from yesterday's sweat and last week's rain. Your boots are damp. Your joints creak. You're 23 years old, but feel 73. This is what trade does to a person. Downstairs, it's already a hive of semi-functional activity. Someone's stoking the fire. Someone else is shouting about lost scales. The youngest apprentice is still asleep with a piece of stale bread in his mouth. Your father is barking orders between gulps of watered-down ale Because remember, the water might kill you. The bread is hard enough to be used as a weapon, but you chew it anyway, while mumbling morning prayers through crumbs and yawns. You've got an hour before the stalls open. That means one frantic, chaotic hour to sort, pack, and inventory the goods. Today's wares? Dried fruits from the south, coarse wool from the north, some ceramic jugs with only a few chips in them, and spices so rare you're not even sure they're real. You organize everything into crates and baskets. Anything light enough to carry or strap to the mule without it collapsing from existential dread. Speaking of the mule, she's outside, staring into the void like she's rethinking every life choice. Her name is Magda. She's stubborn, flatulent, and your most reliable employee. You throw a burlap sack over her back, mutter an apology for whatever horrors await, and begin the slow procession to your market stall. The streets are already alive with the smell of morning commerce. Smoke curls from crooked chimneys. The cobblestones are slick with mystery liquids. Bakers hawk their blackened loaves. Butchers swing meat hooks like it's an interpretive dance. And the fishmonger is yelling something unspeakable at a dog with 3 legs and no shame. You pass the tanner's shop. You hold your breath. You fail. The stench of soaked hides and chemical nightmares punches you in the throat. You pass a woman selling onions from a wheelbarrow. She eyes your goods like she's considering theft as a viable career path. You nod politely. Never show weakness. Never break eye contact. Onions are power in this town. You reach the market square, a muddy, trampled battlefield of tents, wagons, crates, shouting men, squawking chickens, and a goose with territorial issues. Your spot is between the ale cart and the man selling dubious relics. St. Cuthbert's real toe. It's not prime real estate, but it's dry, mostly level, and only slightly haunted by the ghost of last week's price war. You set up your stall, 2 planks across a pair of barrels, a faded cloth banner with your family's crest, which, let's be honest, looks more like a potato than a lion, and a little chalkboard for prices, though half your customers can't read and the other half pretend they can't to haggle better. Your neighbors are setting up too. The cheesemonger is already arguing with the cooper about barrel leakage. Someone drops a crate of apples and blames the devil's wind. A monk passes by with a disapproving stare and a pouch full of coins. You pretend not to see the town pickpocket who's currently failing to rob a blind man. You lay out the goods with all the finesse of someone who hasn't slept in days and hasn't bathed in longer. Presentation matters. You dust the jugs. You fluff the wool. You sprinkle the figs with a little flour to make them look freshly imported. You try to position the spice jars at eye level, just out of reach, because if anyone actually opens them, the jig is up. By the time the first customer arrives, you've already been awake for hours, shouted at 2 apprentices, dodged a goose attack, and inhaled enough chimney smoke to become a medieval brisket. And it's not even mid-morning yet. But this is your life. This is the marketplace, a constant pulsing storm of noise, smells, bargains, threats, half-truths, full lies, and the occasional miraculous sale. You've got 10 hours of standing, haggling, and smiling ahead of you. And you'd better hope it goes well, because if you don't sell enough today, dinner might be turnip water and broken dreams. Welcome to the morning grind of a medieval merchant. You've made it this far. Just 14 more hours to go. You weren't born a peasant, which means from the moment you popped out of the womb, somebody was already haggling over how many bolts of wool you were worth. Your cradle? A reused shipping crate that once held dried figs from Florence. Your first rattle? An old coin tied to a string, because nothing soothes a baby like the sweet jingle of potential profit. While other children learned to walk, you learned to count by stacking copper pennies and then watching them disappear into your father's pouch with a muttered, "Market losses, my dear." See? Medieval merchants didn't just run businesses, they were the business. Their homes were their storefronts, their children were unpaid interns, and retirement wasn't a thing. You worked until your candle burned out, or your cart rolled into a ravine. Whichever came first. And if you were born into a merchant family, guess what? You didn't choose the trade life. The trade life chose you. There was no career day, no wandering into a field and thinking, I could be a falconer. Nope. You were already being fitted for your future, and it came in the form of itchy wool tunics, ledgers smeared with mutton grease, and endless hours learning how not to get swindled. By age 5, you were shadowing your father in the stall, repeating the 3 sacred rules of medieval commerce. First, never trust a man who praises your goods too quickly. Second, always check the scales before weighing the salted fish. Third, if someone says, "I'll pay you next week," run. By 7, you knew how to tell the difference between good linen and the stuff that fell off the back of a cart in Bruges. You could identify 6 types of regional cheese and 3 types of cheese imposters, all of which smelled like someone's feet had made peace with a turnip. By 9, you were helping tally inventory, dodging drunk customers, and correcting your uncle's math. Uncle Bartholo had taken 1 too many tankards of ale, and now believed 2 chickens equaled a barrel of wine. He wasn't wrong, technically, just deeply optimistic. The family shop was never quiet, never clean, never boring. You'd have a caged goose honking beside a sack of dried apples, spices in jars labeled "definitely not dirt," a stack of wooden combs next to wool trousers with suspicious stains. The customers, everyone from wandering monks to nobles slumming it in disguise. Some paid in coin, others offered goods in trade, like a goat with a limp and a personality disorder. Your siblings weren't spared. Oh no, everyone pulled their weight. Your older brother stood outside, shouting deals like a medieval town crier with no volume control. Your little sister ran change back and forth between customers and your mother, who could haggle a man into selling himself for less than he wanted. And speaking of mothers, don't think merchant women just stirred soup and prayed. Merchant wives were often deadlier than bandits when it came to business. They ran shops, managed money, memorized who owed what, and somehow still made enough barley stew to feed 10 people and a half-starved cat. A daughter in a merchant family wasn't just a future bride. She was a future business partner, expected to know her wool weights and spot a counterfeit coin faster than she could say, "My dowry's non-refundable." Training was constant. Your bedtime stories were cautionary tales about bad trades and dishonest buyers. And that, my child, is why we never accept wine in clay jugs from men with twitchy eyes. You didn't get toys, you got ledgers. Instead of hide and seek, It was, "Find the misplaced invoice before father loses his temper." If you were lucky, your family had a network, relatives in other towns who could send goods, gossip, or warnings. Cousin Petrus in Ghent? He'd send word if the wool market was dipping. Aunt Elise in Paris? She knew which inns didn't water down the ale and which toll-keepers could be bribed with salted eels. And if you were really lucky, you might be sent to apprentice with another merchant. This meant leaving home to live in another town, in another stall, where someone else shouted at you for overcounting peppercorns. It was like being adopted, but with more yelling and less food. But it taught you the ropes and the knots and the exact number of steps it took to run from a disappointed customer with a bad loaf of bread. By your teens, you weren't just part of the family trade. You were the trade. You could calculate profit margins in your head, smell a spoiled egg from 10 paces, and survive a 5-hour market day without collapsing from boredom, cold, or existential despair. You had calloused hands, a sharp tongue, and the ability to speak 3 dialects of angry customer. And yet, this life was strangely respected. Merchants weren't quite nobles, but they weren't muckrakers either. You were in the middle, smelling like cheese, but with better boots. Towns needed you. Nobles needed you. Even monks needed you. Because who else was going to supply the ink, the vellum, and the incredibly overpriced imported raisins? But don't think for a second this meant comfort. This was still medieval Europe. You might be educated, but the fleas didn't care. Your boots still leaked, your roof still groaned when it rained, and your family arguments still took place in the middle of the shop in full view of horrified customers. There were no holidays, no sick days, just days when the market was closed and you panicked because that meant 0 sales and possibly starvation. And if the weather turned bad, too bad. You still opened the stall, teeth chattering, nose running, trying to sell barley to a man who just wanted to go home and die in peace. But there was pride in it, a strange, stubborn pride. You weren't scraping in fields. You weren't begging for scraps. You were part of something, loud, smelly, chaotic, and unrelenting. You were born into business. And, whether you liked it or not, business was now your entire life. Welcome to the merchant's world, where the ink stains your fingers, the math stains your soul, and the haggling never, ever ends. Now, let's talk about a famous merchant in medieval times, Richard Whittington. Not the nursery rhyme, not the boy with a cat who made a fortune and heard bells calling him back to greatness, but the man himself, a real person, a real politician, and a figure whose life straddled the border between fact and folklore. He was born sometime around 1354, the 3rd son of a gentry family in Gloucestershire. As the 3rd son, he stood to inherit very little. In a world that revolved around land and lineage, that left him with one option: trade. And for trade, there was only one place to go: London. It would have taken days to reach the city by horseback or on foot, a journey across muddy paths and through plague-haunted villages. But Whittington made the journey like many ambitious men before him. He arrived in London not as a prince, not even as a master, but as a young man with no property, no title, and no real name in the merchant world. What he did have, however, was an instinct for survival and a sharp eye for opportunity. Whittington became a mercer, a cloth merchant dealing in luxurious fabrics like silks and velvets. These were not wares for commoners. These were the fabrics of the court, the church, and the rising class of wealthy landowners eager to dress like nobility. Whittington understood what they wanted, and he gave it to them. Beautiful cloth, delivered on time, with just enough flattery to make a nobleman forget the price. But cloth was only the beginning. He learned to navigate the delicate power games of London's merchant class. Men who loaned to kings, argued over tariffs, and built entire streets with the profits of wool. Whittington's business thrived, not only because he knew fabric, but because he understood people. Who needed what, who owed whom, and, perhaps most importantly, who was desperate. By the 1370s and 1380s, Whittington had grown wealthy enough to begin lending money to the crown itself. A risky venture in uncertain times. England was plagued with unrest, uprisings, war, and changing rulers. But Whittington was careful. He stayed loyal not to a man, but to London. And London, in turn, began to trust him. In 1397, he was appointed Lord Mayor of London, first to fill a vacancy, then by election. That would be the first of 4 terms. Unlike many wealthy men of his age, Whittington did not hoard his success behind high walls. Instead, he gave generously. He donated to hospitals, paid to rebuild parts of Newgate Prison, and established a library at Guildhall. He financed the construction of a public lavatory near the Thames, something the city desperately needed. He left money for the poor, for the education of orphans, and for the repair of crumbling roads. Some said he gave too much. Others whispered that his generosity was a kind of vanity. But whether for pride or purpose, the results were real. London changed because of him. And still, the stories persisted. The folktale emerged sometime after his death. It claimed he had once been a poor boy who arrived in the city with a cat. The story went that he tried to leave London, beaten down and penniless. But as he walked away, he heard the bells of Bow Church ringing in the distance. They called to him, "Turn again, Whittington, Lord Mayor of London." And so he returned. In the legend, his cat sailed to foreign lands and earned him a fortune by ridding a foreign king's court of rats. When the ship returned with treasure, Whittington became rich, powerful, and noble. The real story was more complex and more impressive. His success had little to do with cats and everything to do with accounting ledgers, legal contracts, and calculated risks. He didn't stumble into wealth. He built it. He lent to kings, negotiated with nobles, and never forgot the weight of the poor on the streets below his windows. He died in 1423, an old man by the standards of the time. He left behind no children, no great romantic legacy, but his name echoed through the city long after he was gone. Almshouses bore his name. His money continued to feed the poor. The public buildings he funded became permanent features of the London landscape. And the cat? No one really knows where that part of the story came from. Some say it was added by storytellers to make his rise more dramatic. Others claim it was a nod to his humble beginnings. In 1949, workers digging beneath one of his old buildings found the mummified remains of a cat, bricked into the foundation, likely placed there as a charm against evil. Whether it was his or not, the cat had become part of the Whittington myth, a symbol of cleverness, of loyalty, and of quiet, watchful presence. Not a bad legacy for a cloth merchant. Now, let's go back to you. You've survived another mud-soaked, rat-nibbled night in your drafty merchant hovel. Your back feels like it was attacked by a pack of particularly angry blacksmiths, and your breakfast of last week's pottage tasted suspiciously like despair and onion peels. But never mind that. Today is market day, and in medieval Europe, that's not just a calendar event. It's the Super Bowl, the county fair, and every awkward family reunion rolled into one. Markets are where the action happens. No, not sword fights and tavern brawls, though those do occasionally make guest appearances, but the real action: buying, selling, shouting, spitting, bargaining, cheating, and occasionally being trampled by a goat wearing a bell. The town square begins to transform before dawn. Stalls made of questionable wood and even more questionable engineering creak into position. Some are nothing more than carts with dreams. Others are half-collapsed tents that smell like mold and cabbage farts. The locals shuffle in with eyes full of hope and coin purses full of, well, usually disappointment. But that's never stopped a medieval peasant from haggling like their life depends on it. Because sometimes it sort of does. You, the merchant, arrive with your cart full of hard-earned or dubiously acquired goods: linen from Flanders, salt from Bayonne, dried fish that might be older than your apprentice. You're here to turn cargo into coin. But first, you have to fight for your turf. Not legally, of course. This is medieval Europe. Nothing's that civilized. You jostle elbows with rival sellers, eye the choicest corner, and pretend not to notice that Bertram the butcher has already taken the shady spot you were eyeing. And so begins the market day. Local markets were weekly affairs. Regional trade fairs? Now those were the big leagues. Fairs lasted for days or even weeks. They drew sellers and buyers from distant towns, foreign traders with strange accents and even stranger clothes, and thieves with nimble fingers who could steal your purse and your dignity before you even finished unloading your donkey. If you were lucky, the fair had a charter, meaning it was officially approved by someone in a crown or a cassock. That gave you a little protection, not from pickpockets or bad weather, but from the Lord's men shaking you down for stall fees, entry tolls, or the ever-popular "because I said so" tax. What did people sell? The better question is, what didn't they sell? Barrels of ale, wheels of cheese, bolts of cloth, live chickens, dead chickens, shoes that might actually be turnips. Everything had a price. You might see a peasant trading 3 cabbages for a rusty knife, or a wool merchant loudly swearing, "His cloth is 100% not moth-bitten," as the moths visibly dance behind him. But markets weren't just for goods. They were gossip centers, talent shows, and mobile news networks. Minstrels played for coins. Jugglers dropped things. Charlatans sold miracle cures that cured absolutely nothing. And town criers shouted news, mostly wrong, sometimes dangerous, but always loud. People came from all walks of life. Peasants with stringy hair and empty bellies, nobles with smug expressions, and servants to do their buying for them. Foreigners speaking French, Italian, German, or that suspicious dialect known as "I'm trying to rob you with words." Clergy wandered through, half praying, half shopping. Children darted around, sticky-fingered and suspiciously fast. And then there were the dogs. Oh, the dogs. Big dogs, small dogs, dogs that may have once been wolves, all with fleas, all with opinions, all leaving little souvenirs in the path of your leather boots. As a merchant, your job is to shout louder than the noise, smile wider than your lies, and sell faster than the tax collector can find you. Finest spices from the Levant, you cry, while hoping no one realizes the cumin is actually dried local weeds. Flemish wool, soft as a nun's whisper, you boast, ignoring the fact that it smells like the donkey it arrived on. There's bargaining, of course. Always bargaining. A peasant offers a single egg for a spoon. You scoff. They offer 2 eggs and half a song. You sigh. They add a chicken with a limp. You agree, because, honestly, the chicken's got better negotiating skills than most humans. Midday arrives, and the market is in full swing. The air smells like baked bread, fresh dung, and body odor from 8 different counties. Someone's shouting about miracle fish. Someone else is sword dancing on a barrel. A stray lute string snaps dramatically in the background. It's a symphony of trade and chaos. Food vendors are everywhere, offering meat pies of unknown origin, boiled eels, and roasted turnips on sticks. You grab something vaguely edible and chew while keeping one eye on your cart and the other on your coin pouch. Trust no one. Not even the nun buying onions. Especially not the nun buying onions. In the late afternoon, the fair judges make their rounds. These are officials sent by the town or the church, or possibly just self-appointed bureaucrats with hats. They check weights and measures. They fine people for shouting too loud or not shouting loud enough. They inspect goods, which often look suspiciously like confiscating things for personal use. If your scales are off, even by a pebble's worth, you're fined, flogged, or just yelled at until you cry. As dusk falls, the crowd thins. Farmers head home with empty carts or full stomachs. Foreign traders start packing their wares, counting coins, and watching for thieves. You tally your earnings, try to forget your losses, and wonder if your left boot always had a hole, or if that's a new gift from the pig stampede. Markets and fairs weren't just economic engines. They were the lifeblood of medieval towns. They brought news, music, arguments, laughter, diseases, and every now and then, profit. They turned dusty squares into living organisms, pulsing with humanity's best and worst instincts. They were filthy, loud, and completely essential. And tomorrow, if the weather holds and your donkey doesn't die in its sleep, you'll do it all again. Because in a world without banks, without stock markets, and without retirement plans, the market stall is your lifeline, your theater, your battlefield. Welcome to the medieval marketplace. Hope you brought change and a tetanus shot. Now, let's talk about another famous merchant, Jacques Coeur, a name that once echoed through the royal courts of France and across the glittering ports of the Mediterranean. He was not born into nobility, nor destined for fame, but he built himself into one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in 15th century Europe. And like many who climbed too high, he learned what happens when the powerful no longer find you useful. Jacques was born around 1395 in the city of Bourges, deep in the heart of France. His father was a furrier, a tradesman of modest means who dealt in animal pelts. Not poor, not powerful, just another craftsman in a kingdom struggling to heal from war and plague. But young Jacques had a mind that reached beyond Bourges, beyond furs, and beyond the quiet rhythm of provincial life. He learned numbers. He studied weights, measures, currencies, and languages. And as he grew, so too did his ambitions. He married well, Massé de Léodepart, the daughter of a royal official, and together they built a network, one that reached from the salt pans of the French coast to the spice markets of the Levant. By his 30s, Jacques Coeur was no longer just a merchant. He was a merchant banker, one of the few who understood how to turn silk, gems, and coin into influence. He funded ships. He built warehouses. He created a sprawling trading empire that stretched across the Mediterranean, linking France to Venice, the Middle East, and even Cairo. But Jacques was not simply accumulating wealth. He was engineering trust with local guilds, trust with foreign rulers, and most importantly, trust with the French crown. King Charles VII, the same king who had once relied on Joan of Arc, took notice. France, battered by the 100 Years' War, needed men who could move money as deftly as armies. And Jacques was appointed to the role of Master of the Mint in 1436. It was one of the most powerful financial positions in the realm. He reformed the coinage, balanced accounts, and lent vast sums to the monarchy itself. He became the royal financier, lavishly wealthy, impeccably dressed, and seemingly untouchable. In his hometown of Bourges, he built a palace, a grand one. The Palais Jacques Coeur still stands today, a monument of late Gothic architecture, with sculpted facades, delicate towers, and stone carvings that speak not only of faith and tradition, but of ambition. It was unlike anything the townsfolk had seen from a merchant. It was not subtle, but then again, Jacques was no longer subtle. He had risen higher than any common man had a right to. He wore fine cloth from Syria, spices from Alexandria, jewels from Damascus, and all of it bore his name, his seal, his power. But such brilliance rarely shines without casting long shadows. At court, whispers began. He had made too many enemies, nobles who owed him money, courtiers jealous of his favor. And then, in 1450, came the scandal. A woman was dead, Agnès Sorel, the king's beloved mistress, beautiful, influential, and suspiciously young to have died so suddenly. There were rumors of poisoning, fingers pointed, and somehow, impossibly, those fingers turned toward Jacques. The charges came swiftly. Embezzlement, poison, sorcery, all of it. The court moved fast. His property was seized. His fortune was stripped. He was arrested and imprisoned. For a man who had once dined with kings and negotiated with sultans, the fall was brutal. And while the charges were likely fabricated, tools in a political purge, the damage was done. Jacques was no longer a man. He was a warning, a symbol of what happened when a merchant grew too bold. But Jacques did not die in a cell. He escaped. With the help of allies, some say even the Pope himself, he fled France and found refuge in Rome, and from there he turned east. Old and disgraced, but not broken, he joined a fleet bound for the Levant. A crusade of sorts, a final act. He died in 1456 on the island of Chios, far from Bourges, far from his palace, far from the markets that had once made him rich. Alone, in exile, but not forgotten. Because Jacques Coeur had done something extraordinary. He had shown that wealth, when paired with intellect, could rival the power of blood and title. He had navigated the dangerous waters of war-torn France, had built an empire not on land or violence, but on trade, on ships, on silks and spice. Just like Jacques, you're a medieval merchant with a dream, a cart full of overpriced garlic, and a donkey who hates you. You're up before sunrise, because sleep is a luxury you can't afford, and also because your cartwheel broke yesterday, again. And you've got 30 miles of barely passable road ahead. Your job? Drag overpriced textiles, spices, barrels of half-soured wine, or whatever you're hawking this month from one flea-bitten market town to the next, all while praying your donkey doesn't drop dead and your cart doesn't snap in half over one of the many charming road hazards. Boulders, ruts, puddles the size of a moat, and the occasional decomposing animal no one bothered to move. See, there are no highways, no pavement, no gravel, just long winding paths that were once Roman roads but now look more like cursed trenches. They're muddy in spring, frozen in winter, and dusty death traps in summer. If it's been raining, and it always has, your cartwheels sink into the muck like they're being swallowed by Satan's own oatmeal. And you get to spend a cheerful hour heaving your entire livelihood out of the earth with a stick, while your donkey side-eyes you like it's your fault. Let's talk donkeys, the medieval Uber. You might have one if you're lucky, or an ox if you're wealthier and don't mind moving at the speed of erosion. If you're poor, it's just you and your back, which already feels like it was constructed out of boiled rope and regret. Animals help, sure, but they're also expensive, stubborn, and delightfully unpredictable. They'll stop for no reason, bite you when you're not looking, and have an incredible talent for collapsing from exhaustion exactly 1 mile from your destination. And don't even get started on carts. Yours is made of warped wood, iron nails, and the tears of your ancestors. The wheels are oval-shaped because the village carpenter said circle was a fancy Italian idea, and they rattle like someone shaking a bag of rocks down a staircase. Every time you hit a bump, which is every 2 seconds, you're convinced the axle's going to snap and send your entire cargo flying into a nearby ditch. Speaking of cargo, what are you transporting today? Wool? Salt? Dried fish? Doesn't matter. It smells bad, weighs a ton, and you're paranoid. It'll either spoil or get stolen. If it's anything perishable, congratulations. You're racing against time, weather, and your own ability to not fall asleep at the reins. If it's cloth or spices, you better pray it doesn't rain, because your cart isn't waterproof. And one good downpour turns your fortunes into colorful, soggy garbage. Let's not forget the bridges. Ah, yes, medieval bridges, where dreams go to die. They're made of rotting wood or uneven stone, with just enough gaps to let your wheel fall through, but not enough for a full cart to sink, usually. If you're crossing a river without a bridge, tough luck. You either ford it and risk getting swept away, or pay a ferryman who charges more than your entire inventory is worth. And don't drop anything, because there's no retrieving a barrel of apples from the river unless you enjoy swimming in freezing mud water with leeches. Weather? Hilarious. Summer heat turns your wagon into a mobile oven, while winter wind slices through your cloak like a drunk tailor with a vendetta. Rain is the worst. Wet wool stinks, wood swells, and the roads become slip and slides designed by a vengeful god. You can't see anything through the fog, and even if you could, the only thing waiting ahead is more mud, more tolls, and possibly a peasant throwing cabbage. Let's pause and talk about the other people on the road. First, you've got fellow merchants who are either desperate, smug, or both. Then there are pilgrims, smelly, singing, and likely to ask you if they can ride just a bit, even though they have lice and suspicious stains. And of course, there are bandits, the medieval version of a tax audit, but with knives. They don't care that you barely broke even last quarter. They want your goods, your coins, and probably your boots. So, what do you do when the road splits, the sky darkens, and a group of unwashed men with pointy sticks steps out from behind a tree? You can pray, you can run, or you can try bribery, usually with a bottle of something strong and most of your dignity. By the end of the day, you've covered about 10 miles. You're soaked, sore, and you smell like wet bread. Your donkey is plotting your death. Your cargo's still technically intact, minus a few bruised apples and a sack of flour that may or may not have bugs in it. You've got 5 more towns to hit before the market day, and the next inn is just over the hill, which is medieval for another 3 hours of dragging your soul across gravel. But hey, you're doing it. You're a merchant. You're part of the lifeblood of the medieval economy. You connect villages, feed cities, and keep the spice trade limping along one cartful at a time. Sure, your cart is held together with prayer and panic. Your donkey resents you. Your knees sound like they contain gravel. But without you, towns would starve, nobles would go unclothed, and bishops wouldn't get their imported figs. So tomorrow, you'll do it all again. Because profit waits for no one, and that barrel of pickled herring won't sell itself. Now, let's talk about the Polo brothers. Not Marco. At least, not yet. Before the boy ever stepped onto a ship or set eyes on a silk road, his father Niccolo and Uncle Maffeo had already crossed continents, traded jewels with Eastern princes, and dined in the shadow of Kublai Khan's empire. They were merchants first, explorers second, and survivors above all. It began in Venice, sometime around the early 1250s. Venice was a city that floated on ambition, its power not drawn from armies but from commerce. Its merchants moved like blood through the veins of the known world, sailing the Adriatic and beyond, bartering, bargaining, and brokering with anyone who had something worth selling. The Polo brothers were born into this culture, a family of merchants dealing in rare goods, fine fabrics, and precious stones. Niccolo and Maffeo, like many Venetian merchants, looked east. The Levant, the Black Sea, Constantinople, these were familiar stops, but unlike many of their peers, the Polo brothers kept going, not just toward profits, but into the unknown. Theirs was not a single grand voyage, but a winding series of detours, accidents, and half-intended adventures. Around 1260, the brothers set sail from Constantinople, where they had already established a profitable trading post. War was brewing, and the political tides in the Byzantine Empire were turning. Sensing danger, they withdrew their assets, gathered their wares, likely a combination of jewels, fine cloth, and spices, and headed for the Crimean port of Soldaya. From there, things became unpredictable. They passed through the lands of the Mongols, navigating the territories of the Golden Horde. These were lands ruled not by kings, but by khans, warrior rulers who controlled vast stretches of Central Asia. The Polos were foreigners, but they were useful foreigners. They brought trade, gifts, and information. Their movements brought them eventually to Bukhara, deep in the heart of Central Asia. And it was there, stuck in a city far from home, that their travels took an unexpected turn. War had broken out in the west, and the road back to Venice had become impassable. The Polo brothers were stranded. For 3 long years, they remained in Bukhara, watching the world shift around them, uncertain if they would ever return. But being merchants, they adapted. They traded. They listened. They learned the languages of silk and salt, of tribute and tea. Then came the summons. A messenger arrived from the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler who had claimed the title of Great Khan in the east. Word had reached the Mongol court that 2 Latin merchants were in the region, men who understood trade, diplomacy, and the Christian West. The Khan, curious about these strange men from Europe, requested an audience. So Niccolo and Maffeo packed what they had left and journeyed east once more, this time toward one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. Kublai Khan's court was not a mere palace. It was a city unto itself. Massive tents of felt and silk, halls filled with treasures from across Asia, emissaries from Persia, India, and beyond. And into this whirlwind of diplomacy and spectacle walked the Polo brothers, merchants from a watery city in Europe. They made a good impression. They spoke plainly. They brought thoughtful gifts, and they offered the one thing the Khan seemed to value most: connection. Through the Polos, he saw a link to the distant lands of Christendom, places that had, until then, remained vague shadows at the edge of Mongol awareness. Kublai Khan, impressed and intrigued, gave them a mission. He instructed the Polo brothers to return to Europe with a letter for the Pope. In it, he requested 100 learned men, priests and scholars, who could teach Christianity and Western sciences in his court. He also asked for sacred oil from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It was not a request easily ignored. So the Polos began their return journey, this time as emissaries, not just merchants. But Europe, as always, was in chaos. By the time they reached Acre in 1269, they learned that the Pope had died. With no successor yet elected, their mission hung in limbo. And it was during this frustrating wait that Niccolo learned he had a son, Marco, born in his absence and now 15 years old. They waited. They visited Rome. They were sent back. They waited some more. Eventually, a new pope was elected, Gregory X, and the brothers presented their case. They were not given 100 scholars. They were given 2 friars, both of whom abandoned the mission after the first whiff of danger. Still, the Polo brothers pressed on, and this time, they brought young Marco with them. But that is another story. What matters here is what came before. Because before Marco's grand journey, before the famous tales of China and the emperor's court, before the book that would make his name echo through history, there were 2 Venetian merchants lost in a world of shifting empires and foreign tongues. Men who carried satchels of sapphires and rubies through deserts. Men who sipped fermented mare's milk with Mongol warlords and made polite conversation while the fate of nations turned around them. Niccolo and Maffeo did not go looking for legend. They went looking for business, But the Silk Road rarely offered one without the other. They returned to Venice after nearly 15 years away, their minds heavy with knowledge and their hands lighter than when they left. Not every venture had been profitable. Not every promise had been kept. But they had survived barely. And in the world of medieval merchants, survival was often the highest measure of success. In case you forgot, being a merchant means you've chosen a life of danger, debt, and doing math in your head with no paper, no pen, and barely any formal education. But hey, if it works, you might just afford a roof that doesn't leak and shoes that don't double as sieves. Let's explore the economic side. The first rule of the trade: buy low, sell high. Sounds simple, right? It's not. It's never simple. Because nothing in the Middle Ages is ever simple. Everything wants to kill your profit margin. The weather, the roads, the tax man, your competitors, and your cousin Jeff, who swears he knows a guy selling cheap salt, but instead leads you straight into a den of counterfeiters peddling powdered chalk. Let's start with the basics. How much is something worth? Well, what's it worth here? What's it worth there? And what's it worth once you survive getting it there? You calculate a price spread. If flax sells for 2 denarii in your town and 8 denarii 2 valleys over, congratulations, you've found a margin. But margins lie. You still need to subtract travel costs, tolls, bribes, livestock feed, cart repairs, and the price of that fishy-smelling tavern soup that may or may not have been made from rat. Then there's supply and demand, medieval style, which means no charts, no graphs, no helpful economic theories, just gossip. Who's getting married soon? Who had a bad harvest? Which abbey is running low on candles? You keep your ears open at the tavern, the market, and the town well. You don't trade based on facts. You trade based on rumors, hunches, and the desperate hope that your 3-day walk to the next market won't end in financial ruin and foot rot. Let's talk about pricing strategy. You can't just slap a number on your goods and call it a day. No, sir. In this world, everything is negotiable. You set a high price first, way higher than what you actually expect. That's called anchoring. But no one's invented that word yet, so you just call it starting the lie. The buyer scoffs. You shrug. He counters. You frown, like he's personally insulted your goat. You both argue for 15 minutes about a sack of barley until you meet somewhere in the middle and feel equally cheated. This, friend, is the art of the haggle. And it's not optional. In the Middle Ages, haggling is religion. People don't just expect it, they demand it. If you accept a price without arguing, people assume the product is cursed, or you've gone soft in the head. It's theater. It's performance. You're not just selling cloth. You're selling your ability to look indignant while pretending to walk away. Bonus points if you spit on the ground and mutter about the buyer's mother. Now here's the fun part. Your profit only exists if you get paid. And in this century, cash is a luxury. Coins are in short supply. Some people want to trade chickens, others offer credit. Handwritten IOUs sealed with wax and good intentions. You weigh each offer not by what it says, but by who it's from. Sir Hugo the drunk? Nope. Agnes the miller's wife? Maybe. She pays in cheese and never defaults. And don't forget risk. Every trade is a gamble. Take spices, for instance. Imported from the East, sold for a king's ransom. But you have to buy them in bulk. Protect them from rain, rats, and thieving stable boys. and pray they don't spoil before you sell. A single broken jar of saffron can wipe out your entire profit. Want less risk? Sell grain. Everyone needs grain. But the margin's slim, and everyone sells it too. You make less, lose less. It's the medieval version of buying bonds. Not sexy, but safer than betting the farm. Literally. And what about scales and weights? Sure, you carry your own. Brass, iron, well used and probably inherited from your grandfather. But the buyer has his own set too. And surprise, they never match. Everyone accuses everyone of cheating. You say the buyer's weights are light. He says your grain is wet. You argue until your throats go hoarse and settle on a compromise that leaves no one satisfied. This is known as business as usual. Oh, and did I mention seasonal pricing? In winter, firewood and furs go for triple. In summer, fresh vegetables fetch coin from nobles, craving something that didn't come from a barrel. The smart merchant stores goods for months, timing sales like a medieval stockbroker. The really smart merchant spreads his risk. Some cheap goods for the poor, some luxury wares for the rich, and a stash of garlic, because garlic always sells. Plague or no plague, people believe it keeps demons, illness, and annoying in-laws away. But don't get too clever. If you raise prices too high, you draw attention. Angry mobs, greedy officials, or worse, the church. Accusations of usury, profiteering, or sinful greed are just around the corner. One bad sermon, and suddenly, everyone's pointing fingers at the man selling candles for 3 times the price during Easter week. So what do? You lie, you smile, you claim your wax is blessed, or that your cloth is imported from the finest weavers of Bruges, even though it clearly smells like swamp and regret. You add value with your voice, your confidence, your well-practiced shrug that says, "Hey, I'm just a humble merchant. Take it or leave it." And if you're clever enough, if you balance risk like a tightrope walker on a windy day, if you know when to hold your tongue and when to shout loud enough to wake the fishmonger's dog, then maybe, just maybe, you'll make a few extra coins by the end of the week. Coins you'll hide under a floorboard wrapped in rag and prayer and never speak of again. Because profit in the Middle Ages isn't just a number, it's survival. Welcome to commerce, medieval style. Let the haggling begin. Now, let's talk about Cosimo de' Medici. Not a king, not a general, not even a noble by blood. And yet, in his lifetime, he ruled Florence more completely than most monarchs ruled their crowns. He never wore armor. He rarely gave speeches. What he had was money, and he used it like a weapon. Cosimo was born in 1389 into the Medici family, a name that would become synonymous with power, but at the time, they were still climbing. His father, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, had made the family rich through the wool trade and clever banking. Giovanni was practical, low profile, hard-working, uninterested in luxury for its own sake. But his success gave Cosimo a foundation: wealth, respectability, and, most importantly, a place at the table in Florence's elite circles. Florence wasn't like other cities. It wasn't ruled by a king or duke, but by a rotating cast of merchants, guildsmen, and elected officials. In theory, it was a republic. In practice, it was a stage where money whispered in the shadows and men, like Cosimo, wrote the script. Cosimo learned early that power in Florence did not come from swords or titles, but from influence, earned, bought, and borrowed. His family's fortune came not just from cloth, but from trust. The Medici Bank was one of the most respected in Europe. It handled the accounts of nobles, merchants, and even the Pope, and every florin that passed through its ledgers brought with it a favor, a secret, a quiet promise. By the time Cosimo took over the bank, he wasn't just managing money, he was managing people. A bishop in debt, a noble looking for a loan, a guild master who needed credit. Cosimo kept records, yes, but he also kept lists. Who owed him, who crossed him, and who could be persuaded with a timely gift. Still, his power made enemies. In 1433, one of Florence's rival factions finally acted. Cosimo was arrested, accused of manipulating the Republic for personal gain. It was a dangerous moment. In medieval politics, exile was common. Execution wasn't rare. But Cosimo didn't panic. He did what he always did. He paid. While imprisoned in the Palazzo Vecchio, he used his connections and his coin to turn the tide. The guards were bribed. The judges were reminded of old debts. And when the vote came, Cosimo was spared death, but sent into exile in Venice. It lasted 1 year. Without Cosimo, Florence floundered. Trade suffered. Investments dried up. Political rivals couldn't keep the balance, and all the while, Cosimo worked from afar, funding allies, shaping opinions, waiting. In 1434, he returned to Florence not as a prisoner, but as its quiet master. From that point on, he never held formal titles, but everyone knew who ran the city. He stacked the government with allies, funded public works, and ensured that the Medici name was tied to everything good that happened in Florence. He was generous to the poor, respectful of religion, and utterly ruthless behind the scenes. He also had taste. Cosimo poured money into the arts and learning. He funded libraries, collected ancient texts, and became a patron of architects like Brunelleschi, the man who designed the great dome of Florence's cathedral. He supported painters, poets, and philosophers. He didn't just want power. He wanted to be remembered. And he was. His investments helped birth the Renaissance. But make no mistake, Cosimo's Florence was not free in the modern sense. Elections still happened, yes, but the list of eligible candidates were often edited. Debates were held, but the outcomes were known in advance. And if you opposed the Medici too loudly, you might find yourself unemployed, impoverished, or politely exiled. Cosimo didn't rule with a sword. He ruled with silence, with gifts, with accounts settled privately. He understood that the most powerful force in Florence was not the law, but the ledger. He funded popes, and popes repaid him. He backed sculptors who would one day redefine beauty. He brought in Greek scholars from Constantinople to translate ancient texts, long forgotten in the West. He surrounded himself with thinkers, not soldiers. And yet, no fortress in Italy was stronger than the network of favors he built. When he died in 1464, Florence mourned him not as a merchant, but as a father. They called him Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. He'd been a banker, yes, a businessman, a patron, a political puppeteer, and yet he had done what few men of trade ever achieved. He had reshaped a city in his image. He left behind a fortune, a legacy of beauty, and a dynasty. His grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, would go on to rule Florence in even grander style. But it was Cosimo who laid the groundwork, who proved that in the right hands, gold could be sharper than steel. And as for Florence, it never quite went back to being a republic again. Not really. The Medici would rule, be exiled, and return again and again. Popes would rise from their family line. Queens would be born from their blood. The Renaissance would flourish under their patronage, and the city of merchants, weavers, and bankers would become the cradle of modern Europe. All because one man understood that behind every canvas, every cathedral, every speech and statue, there was a bill to be paid. And Cosimo de' Medici always knew how to foot the bill. You've just decided to hit the open road in the year 1325. Bold choice. You packed your finest cloak, a sack of somewhat legally acquired wool, and the naive hope that you'll make it to the next town with all your teeth and most of your merchandise intact. You're a medieval merchant, after all. Part entrepreneur, part mule, part walking robbery target. Now, you may think the road is a place of freedom, but this isn't some romantic medieval travel montage. There's no lute music, no scenic drone shots. It's mud. Endless, boot-sucking, ankle-snapping mud. And horse poop. So much horse poop. If the weather's not drowning you, it's freezing you. And if the weather's somehow taking a break, don't worry. The bandits aren't. Because guess what? There are no police, no roadside emergency services, no one to call except maybe St. Christopher, and even he's busy not answering your prayers. The king's men don't patrol these roads, too busy taxing grain or stabbing the French. So every time you leave a city gate, you might as well be ringing a dinner bell for every outlaw within 10 miles. And let's talk about those outlaws. They don't look like charming rogues. They're hungry, desperate, and armed with whatever sharp thing they could pull off a corpse last winter. They don't want your opinions or your business card. They want your purse, your mule, and maybe your boots, if they're not completely covered in last week's puddle of cow intestines. And if they don't get it, well, let's just say you better have a convincing, I'm not worth robbing face. You could travel in a caravan for protection. Safety in numbers, right? Sure, until one wagon wheel breaks and everyone stares at you like you're the reason the trip's cursed. Your fellow merchants are less of a brotherhood and more of a loose alliance of men who absolutely will abandon you the moment the sky turns black or someone hears the faintest rumor of wolves. And yes, wolves. Those are a thing too. Now about your wagon. You thought you were clever, strapping all your goods into one big wooden cart. Congratulations. You've invented a giant, splinter-filled anchor. It tips on uneven stones, cracks when it's cold, and if a wheel breaks, and it will, you'll spend the next 6 hours on your knees in freezing muck, hammering it with the same rock you used to fight off a goose earlier. That's right. Even the wildlife's trying to mug you. Then come the tolls. Oh, yes. Did you think roads were free? Think again. Every lord, baron, and vaguely ambitious pig farmer has claimed a right to tax travelers on their land. You pass through 5 villages in a single day? That's 5 tolls. 6. If the local bishop decides you owe God some silver. 7. If someone's cousin needs a new roof. You'll cough up coins for bridges, gates, even to pass under a rope that someone strung between 2 trees, and declared a checkpoint. You don't pay? They take your stuff. Or your mule. Or they just accidentally lose your travel papers in a fire that mysteriously smells like wine and smug satisfaction. And don't get too cozy. Just because you made it to dusk, you're still miles from the next town, and no one travels after dark unless they have a death wish or a really aggressive debt collector on their tail. Night on the road is a whole new flavor of awful. No light, no shelter, no help. Just you, your terrified mule, and the deeply unsettling sound of something very large moving in the woods. Maybe it's a deer. Maybe it's a bear. Maybe it's God reminding you that you should have become a monk. And food? Hilarious. If you didn't pack salted meat and hard bread, enjoy chewing on regret. Water's either from a suspicious puddle or a stream so frigid it gives your tongue frostbite. You haven't bathed in 3 days, and neither has anyone else. Your clothes smell like a wet dog rolled in fireplace ash, and your boots now weigh 5 pounds each from layers of mud, despair, and the ghosts of better travel decisions. Sleep? Don't even try. Unless you enjoy curling up under your cart like a very ambitious possum, fending off frostbite, and praying you don't wake up with a hedgehog nesting in your trousers. If you're lucky, you'll get a wink of sleep before your mule farts directly into your face, or a distant scream reminds you that the bandits have found someone slower than you. For now. But somehow, you survive. You limp through the last toll gate, crusted in filth and fury. Your boots are ruined. Your back feels like someone folded you in half and forgot to unfold. You haven't pooped in 2 days. Because the last time you squatted in the woods, you saw something with red eyes. But you made it. And that's just the first leg of the trip. So next time you complain about rush hour traffic or flight delays, remember, at least you're not dragging 90 pounds of cloth through a bandit-infested bog while arguing with a toll collector who believes your travel license is actually a cleverly disguised love letter to his wife. Welcome to life on the open road in medieval Europe. Bring coins and a weapon, and maybe say a prayer, just in case St. Christopher's actually listening this time. You've survived another day dragging sacks of wool, sacks of grain, sacks of something vaguely fishy smelling, but supposedly valuable, through miles of medieval sludge. Your shoes gave up 2 villages ago. Your knees are whispering threats. And now, just as your spine makes a sound like someone stepping on dry twigs, you reach your final destination, the medieval inn. Let's lower your expectations right now. The word inn might conjure images of candle-lit warmth, soft feather beds, a steaming stew, and a friendly keeper who offers mulled wine and life advice. Absolutely none of that is here. What you've got instead is a crooked, smoke-stained timber structure, possibly on fire, definitely infested, and barely standing up out of pure stubbornness. The sign above the door is swinging in the wind. It says something in Latin, which you can't read because you're a medieval merchant, not a monk. Inside, the smell hits you first. It's a welcoming bouquet of wet wool, old beer, and human feet. Add to that the faint scent of roasted meat, though it's unclear if the animal was fully dead before it went on the spit. That's tonight's dinner. You'll eat it anyway. The innkeeper greets you without actually making eye contact, which is probably for the best. He smells like a combination of sweat and questionable business practices. He grunts at you, and you grunt back. That's medieval hospitality in action. You ask for a room. He laughs. No one gets a room. What you get is space on a mattress, if you're lucky. What you get is a wooden floor, if you're not. What you get is company, whether you want it or not. Welcome to the communal bed. It's a medieval tradition, like plague and religious guilt. Beds are shared by everyone from merchants like you to pilgrims, beggars, and whoever's been drinking at the tavern long enough to forget how to walk home. You will now sleep beside strangers, possibly on strangers, possibly under them, if they roll aggressively. There are no sheets, no privacy, and no guarantees that anyone in this pile has bathed in the past 6 months. If someone coughs, congratulations, you're getting it. If someone snores, it's a duet. If someone dies in the night, again, not your problem, unless they fall on you. Let's talk about the mattress, shall we? It's a sack of straw that has seen things. The straw is old, matted, and smells like it once belonged to a horse, which, frankly, it probably did. You lie down, and a bug introduces itself. There's no point fighting it. The fleas have tenure. They were here before you, and they'll be here long after. Medieval innkeepers aren't cleaning these beds. They're just flipping them over occasionally and hoping the lice don't unionize. But hey, maybe you're lucky. Maybe tonight you get a spot near the fire. It's warm. It's also smoky enough to age a ham. Your lungs will protest. Your eyes will water. You'll cough yourself to sleep beside a man named something like Big Arnulf, who insists on sleeping shirtless. He's hairy in ways you didn't know were possible. And let's not forget the tavern below. The tavern is the social heart of every decent inn, which is to say, it's the loudest, drunkest, sweatiest place within 50 miles. Men shout, women shout louder. Someone sings a song with only one verse repeated endlessly and off-key. Someone tries to juggle apples. Someone else loses a tooth. There's at least one brawl, one goat, and a man dancing on a table with no pants. You'd love to join in. But you're broke, tired, and aware that the last person to insult the local beer was found in the morning with a mug in his mouth, and no explanation. So instead, you huddle in your half-buggy bed, trying to sleep while the tavern erupts beneath you, like a musical volcano, fueled by fermented barley. Every time the door creaks open, the whole place erupts in either cheers or accusations of cheating. You're not sure which is worse. Eventually, blessed unconsciousness comes. Maybe you dream of a warm bath. Maybe of a bed with no legs sticking into your back. Maybe of a meal that didn't try to crawl away before it was cooked. And then, before you've even begun to drool, the rooster crows. A real one outside. Or possibly a man pretending to be a rooster. Either way, it's dawn, and the day starts again. You sit up slowly. Your neck clicks like a poorly tuned lute. You discover you've been spooning a Flemish textile dealer named Bert. You nod politely. He nods back. No one speaks of what happened. That's the code. You eat breakfast, meaning stale bread, a suspicious egg, and maybe beer, because the water might kill you. You settle your bill, which is outrageously high, but the innkeeper swears it's fair and possibly backed by divine law. You grumble. He grunts. It's all very civilized. And then you hit the road again. Your boots are still wet from yesterday. Your pack is still heavy. And your joints ache in ways that suggest you've angered a small god. But hey, you made it through another night. You didn't die. You only almost died. And in the Middle Ages, that counts as luxury. So onward you go. More towns, more trade, more fleas, and yes, more inns. Welcome to the life of a medieval merchant, part adventurer, part accountant, full-time human pincushion for the ecosystem inside every straw mattress. And tonight, you'll probably sleep with strangers again, because privacy is a luxury, and you, my friend, are in the business of survival. You've just arrived at the border crossing between two medieval kingdoms. Your wagon is loaded with bolts of cloth, barrels of wine, and sacks of spices. The good news? Your goods have survived the bumpy roads and the ever-present threat of bandits. The bad news? This is only the beginning of a new kind of challenge. Crossing borders, where every step feels like walking through a maze of laws, tolls, and suspicious officials who smell profit in your pockets. Borders in the Middle Ages are nothing like the invisible lines on a modern map. They're marked by customs houses, small stone buildings perched on hilltops or tucked beside rickety bridges. This is where kingdoms claim their share of your hard-earned goods. You pull your wagon slowly forward, the wooden wheels creaking, the horses snorting nervously. The customs officer waits, a grim man wearing a heavy wool cloak and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to shield his eyes. He might look bored, but make no mistake, he's a hawk for any chance to fill his own purse. The first order of business is the toll. No matter the length of your journey or the sweat you poured into packing your cargo, you must pay. Sometimes it's a fixed sum. Other times, it's a percentage of your goods' value. If you're lucky, a modest one. But more often, it's an unpredictable fee set by whoever happens to be in charge that day. You have no choice. Refusing to pay means your goods get stuck in customs until you do, or worse, confiscated entirely. The toll collector pulls out a long list, scribbled in medieval Latin, and begins calling out goods one by one. 20 bolts of cloth, 10 pence. 5 barrels of wine, 15 pence. Each item's toll must be calculated precisely, or risk the official's wrath. You watch carefully, counting coins in your pouch and praying your math doesn't fail you. Overpaying is common. Underpaying could land you in a dungeon, or at best, cause your goods to be seized. Next comes inspection. The customs officers poke and prod your goods as if searching for hidden treasures or forbidden items. They sniff the barrels of wine, glance suspiciously at your spices, and tap the wooden crates. Some items, like salt or iron, might be restricted or taxed differently depending on local laws. Maybe you're carrying cloth dyed with colors only allowed for nobles, or perhaps your spices come from a land whose rulers have a trade embargo. The laws are complicated, always changing, and vary from kingdom to kingdom. Imagine trying to keep track of this in your head while standing in a muddy border crossing, rain soaking your cloak and boots. The officials may not speak your language clearly. You barter with gestures and a few broken words, hoping to explain that you're just a humble merchant, not a smuggler. But their suspicion lingers like the fog creeping along the river. Then there are the bribes. Yes, bribes. The unofficial tolls that grease the wheels of medieval bureaucracy. If you're clever and your purse is deep enough, slipping a coin or two into the official's palm can speed things up or lower the fees. But it's a risky game. If caught, both you and the official face harsh punishment, and your reputation could be ruined. Still, it's often the only way to get your goods through without delay or confiscation. Travelers whisper tales of merchants who got stuck for days at borders, their goods rotting in the rain while they ran out of food and money. Others speak of sudden raids by border guards who pretend to enforce the law but really aim to rob merchants blind. Your nerves tighten. The road isn't just rough on your wagon, it's rough on your patience and your wallet. One of the most frustrating things is the lack of standardization. Each kingdom has its own rules, tariffs, and forbidden goods. A sack of wool might pass freely in one realm, but be heavily taxed in another. Spices legal in one place might be banned elsewhere. Some border towns have special free trade zones where merchants can store goods temporarily without paying tariffs. But finding these safe havens requires local knowledge and luck. Now picture this. You've finally paid the toll, passed the inspection, and are about to move on. Then the officer holds up his hand. "Wait," he says, pointing to your ledger. "Medieval laws require merchants to declare their cargo honestly in writing. But many scribes are illiterate or corrupt. You might find your goods listed incorrectly, or worse, your ledger challenged by a rival merchant who accuses you of cheating. This can lead to a lengthy dispute, with threats of fines or imprisonment hanging over your head. To protect themselves, many merchants carry official permits or licenses granted by the king or local lord. These documents declare that you have permission to trade in their lands and often reduce or exempt you from tolls. But these permits are expensive, hard to get, and sometimes worth little if local officials decide to ignore them. Travelers also need to be aware of market rights. Some towns or cities hold exclusive rights to certain goods or market days, meaning you can't just show up and sell anything you want. Attempting to do so can lead to confiscation or expulsion. The medieval merchant's life isn't just about moving goods. It's about navigating a tangled web of permissions, favors, and rivalries. Here's a particularly thorny issue: counterfeit documents. Some merchants, desperate to save money or avoid restrictions, forge permits or declarations. If caught, they face severe consequences: fines that can bankrupt them, imprisonment, or even public humiliation. The risk is high, but the reward tempting. All this takes a mental toll. You're not just a trader. You're a diplomat, a negotiator, and sometimes a liar. Your success depends not just on what you sell, but how well you understand the laws and customs of each land you pass through. This knowledge is the difference between profit and ruin. After what feels like hours, your wagon finally moves past the customs house. The road ahead is still long, but you've cleared the border, for now. The officials wave you off with a tired nod, already eyeing the next merchant who will soon arrive, heavy with goods and hope. As you push your horses forward, the muddy border road stretches out under a gray sky. You glance back at the customs house, a small fortress of power and profit, where kingdoms guard their wealth and squeeze every coin from passing merchants. It's a place where your dreams of trade meet the harsh reality of medieval rules. So next time you hear about medieval merchants, remember, their journey wasn't just about roads and goods. It was about crossing invisible lines that meant the difference between making a living and losing everything to laws, tolls, and the sharp eyes of suspicious officials. The border crossing was a game of wits, patience, and money. And the house always won. Now, you've just boarded a medieval merchant ship somewhere along the bustling coast of the North Sea in the year 1325. The good news? The ship is still afloat. The bad news? That's only half the battle. You stand on the creaky wooden deck, your boots wobbling as the ship sways and creaks like an old man struggling out of bed. There's no engine humming here, no captain's cabin with glowing instruments, just sails, ropes, and a handful of burly sailors who look like they haven't seen a proper bath since last Christmas, if then. The smell is a heady mix of salt water, damp wood, fish guts, and enough sweat to soak through your woolen tunic. Your cargo? Spices, cloth, barrels of salted fish, maybe a few crates of fine English wool, bound for a wealthy Italian merchant. These goods are the lifeblood of your trade, and the reason you've left dry land behind. But getting them safely to foreign ports is another matter entirely. Loading the ship was its own exercise in chaos. Imagine dozens of workers yelling over each other, dragging barrels up gangplanks slick with sea spray. The ship's hold, a dark, cramped cave below deck, was packed tight with every precious thing that could be squeezed inside. Barrels, sacks, wooden crates, stacked so high you wouldn't want to be the one stuck beneath it if the ship heaved too hard in the waves. And then there's the weather. The North Sea is known for being temperamental at best, downright hostile at worst. Storms come out of nowhere, hammering the sails, bending the masts, and drenching everyone on board in icy seawater. A good storm means sleepless nights clinging to wet ropes, your fingers raw and numb, hoping the ship won't break apart. A bad one? Well, let's just say more than a few merchant ships never returned, lost to the sea, and forgotten like some drowned city beneath the waves. You try to steady yourself as the ship lurches again. Up above, seagulls cry, more like a warning than a welcome. Below deck, rats skitter between barrels, eyeing your cargo with the same greed you feel for a good profit. You curse the vermin quietly. They're just one of many pests threatening your livelihood. Pirates are another. Unlike today's fantasy tales, these were not charming rogues, but ruthless thieves who saw every merchant ship as little more than a floating bank to be emptied. Ships sailing between ports like London, Bruges, Venice, or Genoa had to be prepared for attack at any moment. The crew were often armed with rusty swords, crossbows, or even early forms of hand cannons, but against a well-armed pirate gang, it was often a losing battle. Your heart races at the thought. Every journey was a gamble, risking cargo, crew, and life itself for the slim hope of a profit in a foreign market. When the ship finally slips into a foreign port, it's no less challenging. You might think a port is a simple place to unload goods. In reality, it's a world of its own, a chaotic maze of docks, warehouses, customs officers, and languages you barely understand. If you're lucky, the locals speak some form of your language, or you have a trusted interpreter. If not, expect a lot of grunts, hand gestures, and frustration. Customs houses loom like grim gatekeepers. Here, officials inspect every crate and barrel, weighing goods, assessing taxes, and demanding fees. Bribes are a common currency to smooth over delays, but even with coin-changing hands, inspections can drag on for days. Meanwhile, your goods sit rotting in the damp air or exposed to thieving hands. Navigating foreign laws and regulations is an art form, and one mistake could cost you dearly. Some ports forbid the sale of certain goods to protect local merchants. Others demand that foreign traders only sell at designated markets or pay exorbitant tolls for the privilege. Ignorance isn't bliss. It's bankruptcy. Then there's the ever-present threat of disease. Ports were melting pots of people, animals, and goods from across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Along with your cargo, you might unknowingly import plague, fleas, or other deadly illnesses. Many a merchant found themselves quarantined, or worse, sickened by the very trade they relied upon. Despite these hazards, maritime trade was the artery of medieval commerce. It allowed merchants to access spices from the East, fine silks from the Byzantine Empire, and precious metals from across the continent. It was slow and dangerous, but it was also the only way to grow beyond local markets and build wealth. The daily life aboard ship was harsh and relentless. There were no cabins or luxury quarters for merchants, just a cramped space below deck, often shared with the crew and the cargo. The air was thick with the stench of rotting fish, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Rats and lice were constant companions. Meals were basic: hard biscuits called ship's bread, salted meat, and whatever vegetables had survived the voyage. Fresh water was rationed carefully. By the end of a long journey, the crew might be drinking brackish water that tasted more like sea than river. Sleep came in stolen moments, if at all. Watch shifts kept everyone alert to sudden storms or pirate threats. Even during calm days, the constant rocking of the ship made rest difficult. Many sailors and merchants alike suffered from seasickness, a miserable condition that left you weak and vomiting over the side. And yet, for all its dangers, the sea held a strange allure. The horizon stretched endless and open, a promise of new markets and new fortunes. The stars at night guided your path, while the sunrise over foreign shores meant a chance to sell your precious cargo and line your pockets. The ports themselves were colorful, if chaotic. Markets overflowed with goods from distant lands, spices piled in fragrant heaps, bolts of cloth shimmering in exotic dyes, exotic fruits and nuts that seemed almost magical to northern eyes. You'd haggle with merchants from across the world, learning new customs, new weights and measures, new coins and currencies. But every port was also a place of tension. Rival merchants eyed your goods with suspicion. Local guilds jealously guarded their privileges, and foreign traders were often seen as outsiders, sometimes welcomed, sometimes not. Getting your cargo through customs without being swindled required patience, sharp wit, and sometimes a quick bribe. As your ship prepares to leave port, the cycle begins anew, hoisting sails, charting a course across uncertain waters, and hoping the journey will end in profit rather than disaster. So, next time you unwrap a cinnamon stick or smell the rich aroma of pepper on your plate, remember the merchants who risked storms, pirates, disease, and bureaucracy to bring those spices across treacherous seas. Their voyages were not adventures full of glamour, but long, exhausting trials that demanded grit, cunning, and a bit of luck. And you? You survived the journey today. Tomorrow, we'll take another step along the merchant's road. You just stumbled into the buzzing, secretive, and surprisingly ruthless world of medieval merchant guilds. It's the year 1325, and you're a merchant, or at least trying to be one. But before you dream of stacking gold coins or flashing fancy fabrics, there's a tangled web you need to know. The guilds. Guilds are like the medieval version of exclusive clubs, but instead of cocktails, it's all about power, control, and who gets to sell what, where, and how. They didn't just pop up for fun. These guilds ruled commerce, and if you wanted to make a living, you had to play by their rules. Imagine a group that polices your every move, decides if you're allowed to sell bread or cloth, and can shut you down faster than you can say, "Market day." You wake up in your modest merchant's room. The sun is just peeking through the smoky air of the town, and already merchants are shouting prices, lifting barrels, and eyeballing each other suspiciously. But before you can set your stall or pack your goods, the guilds have already claimed their turf. Every trade, be it cloth, spices, pottery, or ironware, belongs to a guild that controls it fiercely. Trying to sell outside their rules is not just frowned upon, it's dangerous. Guilds were founded with one goal: to protect their members from competition, especially from outsiders or untrained traders. They enforced strict rules about who could join, what goods you could buy or sell, and how much you could charge. It wasn't just about making a profit. It was about controlling the entire market. If you weren't part of the guild, your chances of setting up shop were slim to none. Think of it like a medieval monopoly, but with swords and fines instead of lawyers. If you sold goods without guild permission, expect to face hefty fines, confiscations, or worse, a public shaming that could ruin your reputation. Guild officials patrolled the markets like hawks, sniffing out unauthorized sellers with the ferocity of a hound on a scent. Joining a guild wasn't as simple as paying a fee. You had to serve an apprenticeship, sometimes lasting years, where you learned the craft, trade secrets, and the unwritten rules. Imagine being stuck scrubbing floors or hauling goods for a master merchant for a decade, all in the hope you'd one day hold the keys to your own shop. When you finally earned your membership, you were sworn in with oaths to protect the guild's secrets and never undercut fellow members. Once inside, guilds offered protections. Members could call on each other for help, be it loans, goods, or legal assistance. But it was a double-edged sword. Guilds also enforced discipline. Step out of line, and the guild could fine you or suspend your trading rights. Business wasn't just about money. It was about politics, alliances, and maintaining the delicate balance between cooperation and competition. Guilds didn't stop at policing who sold what. They controlled the quality of goods, too. Ever heard of guild standards? If you were a cloth merchant, your fabric had to meet specific measurements and quality. Bakers had to follow strict recipes and weights. Blacksmiths had to produce weapons that wouldn't snap in battle. Guild inspectors roamed the markets, examining goods with suspicion. Sell shoddy wares, and you'd face public humiliation, or even a ban. This quality control wasn't just about pride. It was survival. Reputation was everything. If one member sold poor goods, the whole guild's name was tarnished, and customers would flee. So guilds ran workshops, trained apprentices carefully, and even held public demonstrations of their craft to reassure buyers. They were the medieval consumer watchdogs, but with teeth. Guilds also had political clout. In many towns, guild leaders sat on city councils or advised rulers. They lobbied for favorable trade laws, protected their members from unfair taxes, and sometimes even raised militias to defend the town's interests. Being part of a guild wasn't just a business deal. It was a step into the power structure of medieval society. But with power came corruption. Guild meetings could get heated, filled with bribery and backdoor deals. Some guilds became so powerful they could control entire towns' economies, stifling innovation and keeping prices high. Non-guild merchants were forced to pay tolls or bribes just to pass through certain gates. In some places, merchants had to carry guild passes to prove they belonged. Without one, you were a suspect at best, a criminal at worst. Guilds also protected their secrets fiercely. Ever wonder how merchants kept their best trade routes or recipes hidden? Guild oaths forbade members from revealing trade secrets to outsiders. Breaking this rule meant excommunication from the guild, a merciless sentence that killed your business before you could say, medieval economy. Women's role in guilds was complicated. Most guilds were male-dominated, but some allowed widows or daughters of members to carry on the family business, especially if the men were gone. In rare cases, women ran their own shops, but usually under the protection of a guild. These women had to navigate a world of male authority while trying to keep the family afloat. Guild halls, where members met, were centers of social and economic life. They weren't just offices. They were places for feasts, celebrations, and sometimes quarrels. Imagine a large wooden building filled with smoke from the fire, filled with merchants negotiating deals, drinking ale, and plotting how to outwit rival guilds. These halls were the beating hearts of medieval commerce. But what if you wanted to break free? Some merchants chafed under guild restrictions, dreaming of independence. These free merchants often faced harassment, fines, or worse from guild enforcers. Yet some succeeded, especially those who could afford to pay their way or found niches outside guild control. Still, the guild's grip was strong, and for most, following the guild's rules was the only path to survival. Guild licenses were another gatekeeper. Before you could sell your goods, you needed permission. These licenses came with fees that could be steep, depending on the town or guild. No license, no sale. These fees helped guilds fund their activities, support members in hardship, and maintain control over the market. So, as a merchant in 1325, your day begins not with dreams of wealth, but with navigating the complex world of guilds. They decide if you're allowed to sell your wool, your spices, or your pottery. They set the rules, inspect your goods, and keep rivals at bay. Step out of line, and you risk fines, loss of license, or public disgrace. Yet within these constraints, guilds offered community, protection, and a measure of order in a chaotic medieval world. For better or worse, they shaped what it meant to be a merchant. The freedom to trade was always balanced by the chains of guild control. As you prepare your stall for the market day ahead, remember, the guild is watching. Your success depends not just on the goods you carry, but on how well you play the game they've laid out. Welcome to the world of medieval trade, where who you know and who you belong to can make all the difference between thriving and surviving. And with that thought settling in, you step outside into the noisy, crowded streets of your town, the guild's shadow never far behind. You're a medieval merchant in the year 1325. You think your biggest worry is the weight of sacks on your cart or the dirt under your fingernails? Ha! Try this: customers, credit, and getting cheated. Welcome to the dark arts of medieval commerce. First, picture this. You're standing behind your stall, a rough wooden table piled with bolts of cloth or spices or shiny pots. The market's buzzing. Shouts, haggling, the clink of coins. Now imagine a customer walks up, eyes sharp as a hawk, asking for goods but saying, "I'll pay you next market day." Next market day. That's weeks away. You're supposed to trust them, hand over your goods, and pray they don't vanish like smoke when payment time comes. Spoiler: they often do. Credit in the Middle Ages was a gamble wrapped in hope and coated in suspicion. There were no credit scores, no banks calling to remind you, "Hey, your payment's due." Nope. You had to rely on trust, reputation, and sometimes good old-fashioned threats. If your customer was well known, respected in the town, or connected to powerful guilds, you might take the risk. If not, tough luck, friend. You might be left holding a pile of worthless promises instead of coins. Why extend credit at all? Because competition was fierce, and if you said no, your rival across the way might say yes and steal the sale. So you'd weigh your options carefully. How well you knew the buyer, their history of paying debts, and how desperate you were for a sale. Sometimes it wasn't about money. It was about survival, building connections, and securing future business. But those future payments could easily turn into empty air. Now let's talk about the chase. When next market day arrived and your customer still hadn't paid, you couldn't just send a stern email or call a collection agency. You had to get creative. Often, this meant sending someone, maybe your brother or a gruff acquaintance, to find the debtor. This visit was less a polite reminder and more an intimidating visit. Sometimes it involved loud shouting matches in the street, or even threats. Medieval merchants weren't shy about brandishing fists, or worse. But there was no guarantee your debtor would cough up the coins. If they were poor, they simply didn't have the money. If they were cunning, they'd pretend to be poor. The worst offenders could move to a neighboring town or disappear entirely, leaving you to write off your losses. This was the cold reality behind those bright market stalls. Dishonest buyers weren't the only problem. Sometimes you'd be the one cheated. Maybe the coins you received were clipped, literally shaved at the edges to steal a bit of precious metal. Sometimes counterfeit coins circulated and you'd only discover the trick after trying to pay your own suppliers. The medieval merchant's life was an endless battle to spot a fake and avoid being shortchanged. Scales, weights, and sharp eyes were your best defense. And then there were the tales of customers who'd try to return goods claiming they were faulty. Long after the sale, of course. You couldn't easily refuse because refusing might mean losing reputation, or worse, a formal complaint to the guild. Guilds had rules, yes, but they often favored their own members over outsiders or smaller traders. Navigating this web was a tightrope walk for any merchant. The trust you built in your community was fragile. If you were seen as a cheat you'd become. Rumors spread faster than a market day fire, and once labeled dishonest, your business would dry up quicker than a spilled barrel of ale in July. You needed to be shrewd but fair, tough but generous, and always 2 steps ahead of both customers and rivals. And here's a little secret. Sometimes merchants themselves got creative with the truth. Maybe a bit of underweighing or swapping goods. Not outright stealing, but bending rules enough to stay afloat. Survival wasn't just about honest trade. It was about cunning and sometimes outwitting the whole marketplace. Chasing debts, handling dishonest buyers, and maintaining a reputation wasn't just part of the job. It was the job. It demanded patience, nerves of steel, and a readiness for disappointment. Every unpaid debt was a reminder that this world had no safety net, no bailout plan. Your fortune could vanish overnight, lost to a rogue customer or a bad bet on credit. So next time you grumble about chasing invoices or dealing with difficult customers, remember the medieval merchant standing at a creaky stall, counting clipped coins, muttering curses, and hoping that next market day, someone, somewhere, will finally pay what they owe. Welcome to medieval trade, where your goods might be genuine, your coins might be heavy, but your customers, never fully trustworthy. You've just gone from selling turnips off a donkey cart in the rain to sipping wine in a velvet robe, yelling at apprentices from the second floor of a crooked timber house. How? Simple. You clawed your way up the greasy, manure-slicked ladder of medieval commerce, one dodgy transaction at a time. Welcome to the top. Sort of. Let's rewind a bit. Your story starts, as most do, in mud. You're a peddler, part merchant, part pack mule. You don't own a shop. You don't even own a real cart, just a bundle of semi-legitimate goods strapped to your back and a healthy distrust of toll collectors. You trudge from village to village hawking wares like ribbons, knives, maybe a suspiciously imported spice that smells a lot like crushed pepperweed. You sleep in barns, you eat crusts, and your only marketing strategy is yelling louder than the next guy. But then it happens. One day, a small miracle. You manage to sell a bolt of fabric to the bailiff's wife at just the right moment, after she finds her husband snogging the weaver's apprentice. You smile, you nod sympathetically, and you mark up the price by 400%. That's called opportunity, and you seize it with both flea-bitten hands. Now you've got capital. Not much, but enough to stop walking. You rent a stall at the edge of a market square, just far enough from the fishmongers that you can breathe, but close enough to shout at their customers. Your goods improve. A few lengths of dyed wool, some decent pottery, and even a chest of buttons so fancy they look like they might ward off sin. You don't just sell stuff anymore. You curate an experience. You're practically a lifestyle brand. You also hire help. Not real employees, of course. Those are expensive and ask for wages. No, you find an orphan with nimble fingers and questionable morals. You pay them in crusts and kind words. They carry your goods, spy on the competition, and occasionally find things behind other merchants' stalls. You tell yourself it's mentoring. It's definitely not extortion. Probably. Soon, you're making enough money to stop sleeping with your merchandise. You buy a house. Well, a house shop. It's one narrow building crammed between two taller ones, where the first floor is your storefront, the second is for sleeping, and the third is a place to stash all the receipts you never learned to read. Still, you have shutters now. Shutters. You're practically nobility, but it's not enough, is it? You start noticing the real merchants, the ones who don't shout over pigs in the market square. They have proper shops with signs, clerks, and doors that actually lock. They wear actual linen under their coats and smell like soap. You burn with envy. Not literal burning, you can't afford frankincense, but close. So you make your move. You join a guild. This part is tricky. Guilds are like exclusive clubs where men with money, power, and spectacularly ugly hats gather to protect their trade, fix prices, and complain about new blood like you. Getting in means paying dues, swearing oaths, and pretending to care about the mayor's opinion on grain tariffs. You attend banquets where someone inevitably reads aloud from the bylaws until everyone falls asleep face first into their eel pie. But membership has perks, protection from random taxes, a shiny guild badge, and, best of all, the right to kick out non-guild riffraff from your turf, which is exactly what you were last year. But let's not dwell on that. Now you're selling in bulk. You've got apprentices, connections, and enough coin to bribe a city official without flinching. You start importing goods. Real ones this time. Flanders wool, Italian glass, spices that don't come with beetles. You even get a letter of credit from a Florentine banker who wears more gold than your priest's altar. You don't understand how banking works. You're still half convinced it's witchcraft. But the money moves, and that's what counts. Soon, you're a known name. The town knows you. The guild respects you. The tax collector loathes you, which is a great sign. You're not just a merchant anymore. You're a tycoon, a tastemaker, a man of standing. People come to you for deals, advice, and occasionally hush money. You throw banquets. You marry your daughter into another merchant family, combining fortunes like it's Monopoly with more plagues. Then one day, the mayor invites you to a council meeting, not to arrest you. No, that was last year. This time it's different. He wants your opinion on roads and trade routes and how to handle the uptick in counterfeit saffron sales. You nod gravely, hide your involvement, and offer solutions. Congratulations, you've just entered politics. Now you sit at the high table at feast days. Your robes are lined with fur. Your name is etched into ledgers and whispered in taverns. You have enemies now, good ones. That means you've arrived. You fund the cathedral roof restoration and donate just enough to ensure your name is carved into a stone arch above the nave. Because nothing says success like eternal masonry. But let's not forget the truth underneath all that velvet. You still remember what it's like to chase chickens out of your stall. You still bribe guards to overlook your slightly damp spices. You still haggle like your life depends on it. Because in a way, it does. Every coin, every favor, every nod from a powerful man, it all balances on a thread thinner than imported silk. And you know better than anyone how easy it is to fall. After all, you used to be the one scraping wax out of candle ends just to have something to trade. But now, you're the one selling candles at a 600% markup. And people thank you for the privilege. Welcome to the top of the medieval merchant food chain. The view is nice, just mind the smell. The tanner's workshop is still uphill, and drainage is, shall we say, aspirational. You've just been informed you're getting married, not because of love, not even because of mild attraction or shared hobbies like sheep counting or bread not burning. No, you're getting married because your father signed a contract with another merchant family, and now your body is officially part of a business transaction. Isn't that romantic? You see, in the bustling world of medieval commerce, love is for poets and fools. Marriage? That's strategic warfare with candles and cake, if you're lucky enough to afford either. This isn't about soulmates. It's about profit margins. You're betrothed? You probably met them once, maybe twice, maybe never. Doesn't matter. What matters is that their family owns 3 wool stalls by the market square, and your father wants in. He sees their daughter, not as a person, but as a walking investment portfolio with childbearing hips and an inheritance line thick as a ledger. She could look like a toad in a bonnet and have the personality of a wet cabbage, and you'd still say yes. Because that's not a girl. It's a contract extension with legs. Now, let's talk about dowries, the charming medieval tradition of putting a price tag on a uterus. The dowry is a pile of goods, gold, land, goats, or maybe just some sacks of grain if your future in-laws are feeling frugal. It's not a gift. It's insurance. It says, here's a chest of valuables in case your son turns out to be a drunk, dies of plague, or loses the shop in a bad game of dice with a monk. And believe me, all 3 happen with unsettling regularity. Some dowries are big enough to make a man reconsider his vows to the church. Others are so pitiful, you'd do better marrying a well-dressed turnip. But regardless of size, dowries are non-negotiable. Try getting married without one, and see how fast the bride's father calls off the wedding and sends you home with a bruised ego and maybe an egg to the face. But don't think the grooms get off easy. Oh no. Sometimes, grooms' families cough up a counter dowry or a mourning gift, which sounds charming until you realize it's basically the medieval version of, thanks for the womb. Here's a plot of land and a pig. Why? Because women were expected to bear children, work in the shop, manage servants, if you're lucky, and not die in childbirth. Though that last one was more of a hopeful suggestion than a likelihood. And you better believe lawyers, or at least the 14th century version of them, which is to say, literate men with suspicious mustaches, were involved. Contracts were written out in Latin or bad French, depending on how fancy you were trying to look. These were ironclad documents, sealed with wax, signed by witnesses, and taken more seriously than your eternal soul. Breaking a marriage contract could trigger fines, feuds, or full-blown family wars. Ask the Capulets and Montagues how that turned out. Let's not forget, this wasn't just for nobles. Merchants were right in the middle of this mess. In fact, the richer a merchant got, the more cutthroat the matchmaking became. If you were a merchant with coin and clout, you weren't marrying for companionship. You were assembling a dynasty. Your daughter's marriage could open up trade routes in Bruges. Your son's wedding might secure a warehouse in Marseille. This wasn't a wedding. It was a hostile corporate merger in velvet hose. And the negotiations? Picture 2 red-faced merchant fathers hunched over a wobbly tavern table, arguing over whether a second cart of salted herring should be included with the daughter. One wants the dowry up front. The other insists on half, now. Half when the couple produces a male heir that survives past age 5. They haggle like fishmongers over whether the girl gets her mother's brass jewelry, or if that goes to the other daughter who married the tanner's idiot son last spring. And God forbid anyone brings up illegitimacy or past scandal, because nothing says romance like publicly verifying your child's non-bastard status. Once agreed, the marriage is announced. There might be a feast, sure, but don't expect champagne and fireworks. maybe some flat ale, a pie that's more crust than filling, and a lute player who smells like pickled onions. The couple is paraded through the town, like two sacks of flour, bound for the same cart. Smiles are fake. Jokes are forced. Aunt Matilda is already placing bets on whether the bride will last the winter or collapse during the first childbirth like Cousin Beatrice did. Now married, your life is fused. Not just socially, financially. Her family's debts might become yours. Your assets might go to pay off their mismanaged wool venture from 3 Easters ago. You didn't just get a wife. You got a second ledger. And if she dies, that dowry might come back to her family, depending on the contract. Or it might go to the church, because of course it does. Marriage is a partnership, yes. But in medieval trade terms, it's more like a joint stock venture, where someone's always threatening to pull out and blame God. And if you're lucky, really lucky, your wife might be good at business. She might run the shop while you're on the road, keep accounts, or even smack a dishonest apprentice with a broom handle. But she'll get no credit. Not from the guilds, not from the law, and definitely not from your drunk cousin who insists women shouldn't handle coin because their wombs interfere with logic. In conclusion, dear merchant, your wedding isn't about candlelight or poetry. It's about access to ports, access to stock, and the delicate art of turning your bloodline into collateral. You don't get a honeymoon. You get a ledger, a wife, and a whole new list of people who'll sue you if you mess this up. Congratulations. You're married now. And business has never been so personal. You're still coughing up soot from the last winter, still stepping in mysterious street fluids, and still praying your roof doesn't cave in next time it rains. But, and it's a big medieval but, you're no longer just some dirt-smudged vendor yelling about fish near the docks. Now, you're a merchant with clout, influence, maybe even a pair of boots with both soles intact. And you know what comes next, right? Politics. That's right. You, the man who once bartered a half-rotten turnip for soap, now find yourself rubbing elbows with aldermen, guild masters, and other men who own more than one tunic. But don't get too excited. This isn't some noble climb towards civic virtue. No, this is medieval politics, which is less House of Commons and more House of Who's bribing who. It starts small. Maybe you slip the gatekeeper a few extra coins to keep your stall closer to the city square. Harmless, right? Just a friendly thank you in silver. But oh no, friend, that's just the beginning. Because the moment your purse opens, the whole city suddenly has its hand out. Need permission to expand your shop? That'll cost you. Want to avoid the sudden inspection that somehow only targets your stall and no one else's? You'd better donate to the city watch. And if you dare dream of joining the town council, better bring a cart full of favors, flatteries, and very specific gifts, like wine from Gascony, or a bolt of velvet that somehow fell off a passing wagon. You learn fast. You have to. Because behind every official smile is a man keeping score. You grease the right palms, nod at the right dinners, laugh at the right jokes, even when they involve pigs and friars. Every handshake costs money. Every favor costs more. And if you want to keep your business alive and your teeth in your head, you learn to play the game. Guilds are the worst. You thought they were about protecting trades and ensuring fair prices. Adorable. No. Guilds are medieval mafias with matching tunics. Want to join the textile guild? There's a membership donation. Want to speak at the next meeting? Better host the wine-soaked feast after. Want to become guild master someday? Time to start bribing the guy who sharpens the quills for the vote count. Even if you make it onto the town council, don't expect power to feel like power. Expect long meetings in smoky halls that smell like sweat, tallow, and bad decisions. Expect shouting matches over who gets to control the toll bridge this week. Expect grown men arguing for hours about how much salt is too much salt, or whether your cousin's stall is technically 6 inches past regulation. And if you think honesty will win you respect, think again. The honest merchant is like a dry well, rare, suspicious, and usually disappointing. What actually gets things done? Coin, flattery, knowing which constable's son is secretly selling bootleg ale and politely not mentioning it. Sometimes, your bribes make things better. Like when you pay off a judge to let that poor farmer keep his donkey instead of losing it to a tax levy. Sometimes you even fund repairs to a city wall or throw a feast for the plague survivors. You convince yourself it's civic engagement, generosity even. But mostly, it's about profit. You pay to protect your market space. You pay to outbid your rivals. You pay to ensure that when the next grain shortage hits, your sacks get unloaded first. And the people? They mumble. They grumble. They see you in your fur-lined cloak and mutter, "Corrupt swine." But you don't hear them because you're busy counting receipts and trying to figure out whether Bishop Raymond will be more impressed by a silver chalice or a new roof for his chapel. Your enemies aren't just other merchants. No, the mayor hates you because you backed the Tanners Guild in the last vote. The tax collector is still sore because you shorted him last winter and gave his wife a jar of healing cream that was definitely just pork fat and lavender. And don't get started on the blacksmith. Ever since your cart ran over his dog, he's been eyeing you like a man who really wants to forge something pointy. Still, you keep climbing, because the higher you go, the more you can bend the game. Maybe you fund the construction of a new bridge and make sure it ends conveniently near your warehouse. Maybe you sponsor a feast in your name and suddenly your foul-smelling imports become exotic delicacies. Maybe you even get your son married into a noble family and spend dinners pretending that you didn't get your start selling onions out of a barrel that used to hold pickled fish. The city thrives on your kind. It doesn't love you, but it needs you. You bring the spices, the wool, the sugar that rots everyone's teeth. You fund the street repairs, bribe the guards to keep peace, and make sure the grain still flows, even when war is on the doorstep. And in return, you get power. Not the kind with crowns and banners, but the kind that decides which gate stays open and which rival gets inspected by the weights and measures guy with very shaky hands. Is it fair? Absolutely not. Is it moral? Please. But is it how the game is played? Yes. And you wide-eyed peasant turned backroom dealmaker, you're winning. At least for now. Just don't forget, in this city, power is rented, not owned. And the price, always due. And of course you know that. After all, you are a merchant yourself. Thanks for listening. If you're already asleep, great. We've successfully lulled you to sleep. And if you're still awake, Well, that's impressive. If you genuinely enjoy these boring stories about history, feel free to subscribe to our channel whenever you're in the mood. Sleep well, and good night.